Many people have become stars in Hollywood, but Timothy Dalton was one of the few who was right at the wrong time. Even though he was the coldest, grittiest, and most true to the original James Bond, people didn't like him. People liked how Daniel Craig played a serious, down-to-earth James Bond, but Timothy Dalton had done the same thing 20 years earlier, and the reviews were mixed. Why only showed up twice as James Bond when he was so good at it? Why has he never gotten married, even though he sucked up a lot of leading ladies? Behind that cool exterior, was he a lonely man who was always trying to avoid attention and commitment? Timothy Dalton played James Bond more honestly than ever before, but the audience wasn't ready to accept him, which may have been their biggest mistake. Tim Dalton was born in Colwyn Bay, Wales, on March 21st, 1946. His family was a mix of English and American. His father was a British intelligence officer who had been in the Special Operations Executive, SOE, during World War II and was a strict and honest man. His mother was American, which made Dalton a citizen of the United States, even though he grew up and lived most of his life in England. Although Dalton grew up with an intelligent father, he never dreamed of being on stage or in Hollywood. He wanted to be tough like his dad. He wanted to be a soldier, a pilot, or maybe even a real-life spy. As a child, no one thought Dalton would become an actor because he had always been drawn to a life of order, precision, and action in the real world. When Dalton was a teenager, he joined an air cadet training program, planning to work in the military or aerospace in the future. He wanted to be an astronaut for a long time and help explore space. Dalton thought that was the path he was meant to take, from the blue skies to trips beyond Earth's atmosphere. Unfortunately, fate had other ideas. As a child, Dalton went to the theater one day and watched Macbeth by Shakespeare. That was the moment when everything changed. He was shocked by how strong the words were, how strong the emotions were on stage, and how an actor could control a whole room with their voice. He became interested in Shakespeare, music, and stories that were much bigger than himself. At that very moment, his hopes of becoming a pilot, soldier, or intelligence officer went away completely. That's how Dalton knew this was his way, with shadows he hadn't found yet. After the fateful shock of learning about Shakespeare, Timothy Dalton didn't wait to start on his new path. He got into the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, RADA, one of the best acting schools in England, when he was 18. However, Dalton didn't like to wait around like many of his classmates did. He was ready to act and do something right away. He soon made the brave choice to leave RADA before finishing his course. For Dalton, it was a smart move that could have been dangerous. He joined the National Theater and learned how to act on some of the world's most famous stages while immersed in classic plays. Dalton proved himself right away. The young man with a deep, commanding voice, aristocratic presence, and piercing eyes found his perfect place in the world of Shakespearean theater. People were enthralled, and critics quickly paid attention. Not only was this actor good, but he was also going to be a big star. Because of his roles in Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and Henry IV, he became one of the biggest names on the British stage. The theater doors then opened, as if fate had planned it the whole time. The big break came when he got the part of King Philip II of France in The Lion in Winter in 1968. The movie had a great cast, with Peter O'Toole, Katharine Hepburn, and Anthony Hopkins, but Dalton was not overshadowed by them. Timothy Dalton was never a typical actor in movies. He was rogue. Even though he turned down safe roles and never tried to become famous, he became one of the most interesting movie stars of the 1970s. When The Lion in Winter, 1968, did well, Dalton became one of Britain's most promising movie stars. Nevertheless, an actor must leave a distinctive mark in order to become a legend. There was no other way for Dalton to go. Instead of focusing on commercial roles, he chose movies with deep psychological layers and characters who were complicated and conflicted. These roles let him use his powerful voice and piercing eyes to their fullest. Dalton played Prince Rupert, a nobleman caught in the middle of power struggles, in a 1970 historical drama Cromwell, which was about the English Civil War. Her Majesty Queen Mary of Scots in 1971. He changed into Henry Darnley, Queen Mary's doomed husband. A character who seemed like a nice person on the outside, but was really driven and sad on the inside. Year 1970, Wuthering Heights. That moment was important. As Heathcliff, a troubled soul torn between love and revenge, Dalton played the part wonderfully. He really was Heathcliff, not just a character. After that, people saw that Timothy Dalton wasn't just another actor, he was an artist. But even though he had a great reputation, Dalton still needed a part that was mysterious, dangerous, and intensely passionate. Eventually, that time came in 1983. In Jane Eyre, Timothy Dalton played the romantic but unsettling Edward Rochester. His Rochester wasn't your typical nice guy. He was very intense, mysterious, and sometimes cold, but also full of longing. And when he spoke, his deep, sharp voice controlled every scene, making people pay attention to every word and movement. Not only did the movie do well, but it also made Dalton an everlasting romantic movie star. In 1986, Timothy Dalton was performing at the Royal Theatre with Vanessa Redgrave, a woman he had loved very much in the past. This was where he should have been. In Shakespeare's world, words were weapons and stage lights were very important. Then, Ian Productions called him and changed his life for good. People wanted him to play James Bond, which is one of the most famous roles in movie history. It was a huge chance and an important turning point that he couldn't miss. But it also made Dalton think of a scary question. Was this the best fake job Hollywood had ever done for him? Actually, Dalton knew the name James Bond. People had asked him to play the part as early as 1968, when Sean Connery first quit after You Only Live Twice. Producers thought at the time that Dalton, a young actor, could carry on Connery's legacy, but he turned them down. The reason? Those were his only 22 years. Dalton thought Bond had to be an experienced man. It wasn't possible for him to be a boy in a tux, awkwardly holding a Walther PPK. In the end, George Lazenby got the part, and we all know how that went. Bad news. But that wasn't the end of the story. Dalton was again thought about when Connery left for the second time after Diamonds Are Forever in 1971. This time, though, the producers chose Roger Moore, who would play a very different kind of Bond. Endearing, funny, and fun. The franchise went in a more fun and silly direction, making Bond very different from Ian Fleming's original idea. As usual, no one remembered Dalton. By 1981, Roger Moore was getting close to 54 years old and thinking about stepping down. Dalton's name came up again, but Moore chose to stay for a few more years and filmed Octopussy and For Your Eyes Only. In another case, Dalton missed his chance. Then, in 1985, Moore's last movie as Bond was A View to a Kill. This time, fate didn't wait. There was no doubt that Dalton would become the fourth James Bond in movie history, but no one knew that this would also be the start of the end of his career. Dalton never wanted to play James Bond like Connery, or Moore did when he first got the part. He wanted the character to be like Ian Fleming had imagined him, a damaged and cold agent, someone who works for the government more than a famous hero. Dalton spent months studying the source material by reading all of James Bond's books over and over again. Rather than just a womanizer who cracks jokes during high-speed chases, he wanted people to see Bond as a real person. With that resolve, he created a whole new 007 in the Living Daylights, 1987. The script was good, the movie did well at the box office, and critics liked it. Unfortunately, the public wasn't ready for this kind of connection. They had been used to a charming and funny 007 who could kill someone with one hand while smiling slyly for more than 10 years. That wasn't done by Dalton. No flirting or smirks after action scenes like Roger Moore. He was a serious, realistic Bond who was sometimes cruel, which made people feel strange and even uneasy. He came back 2 years later with License to Kill, 1989, which was different from any other Bond movie because it was more violent, dark, and gritty. This time, Bond wasn't just on a mission. He wanted to get even. Bond is torn between doing what's right and caring about his own feelings. He is ready to kill at any moment. The film wasn't true to the traditional image of James Bond, so people didn't like it. However, Dalton was never able to show that he was right or wrong because the Bond franchise quickly went through a terrible event. The studio that distributed the Bond movies, MGM, got into a legal battle with Ian Productions in 1990. This meant that the next Bond movie would not come out until indefinitely after that. In the meantime, Dalton had to wait because he was still under contract with the studio. He was still responsible to Ian's management, so he couldn't take on other big roles. He was not quite Bond, but also not quite anyone else for almost 5 years. When MGM's legal problems were finally over in 1993, they decided to start the franchise over with a new, more mainstream and commercial direction. There were plans to bring Dalton back for more than one movie this time. They wanted a long-term deal that would commit him to many Bond movies. This meant jail time to Dalton. He missed too many chances because he waited too long, and Bond wasn't the role he wanted to keep playing. 1994, Timothy Dalton made it official that he was leaving the role of James Bond. 2 months after that, Pierce Brosnan was cast as the new Bond. The 1995 movie GoldenEye was a worldwide sensation and the start of a bright new era for the James Bond series. Brosnan had the charm of Connery and the elegance of Moore, but he also had just enough of Dalton's energy to make him a Bond who was glamorous enough for fans to love, but not too different from Fleming's original character to be criticized. Brosnan was enjoying the limelight, but Dalton was nowhere to be found in Hollywood. Someone later asked Dalton if he felt bad about leaving Bond. He said he had never liked the idea of playing the part for too long, but the truth was, after he left, his career came to an end. He only appeared in a few TV shows and smaller projects in the years that followed. He never got another part as important as James Bond. The strangest thing about this whole story may have been when Daniel Craig made his acting debut in Casino Royale in 2006. It was said that his Bond was very real, harsh, and more profound than ever. People liked the things about Timothy Dalton that they didn't like about him before. Dalton might not have been a bad Bond. He was just Bond before his time. Still, the question stays, did Hollywood miss out on the perfect James Bond because people weren't ready for him yet? Timothy Dalton played a lot of cold, mysterious, and proud men on screen. In a past life, he loved with the same intensity as the characters he played. This wasn't just a love story. Despite its beauty, the love story between a man who was afraid of commitment and a woman who wanted a real family was sad. Like many passionate but troubled relationships, it did not end happily ever after. She met Dalton Redgrave on the set of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1971. He was a young actor of 25 years, and she was 34 years old, a famous actress with a long career, a husband, and her own children. A mature, smart, and powerful woman, very different from the young, carefree women that Hollywood usually paired its leading men with. I didn't care about the age difference or the social problems, but Dalton did. He was immediately interested in Vanessa. She was hated because she was mean, not because she was famous or pretty. He had never met anyone like Vanessa Redgrave. She was strong, independent, and a fire that wouldn't be put out. But Dalton was set on pursuing her no matter what. He was the type of man who never gave up. They started a relationship that broke all the rules. Vanessa had their love went from strong and passionate to all-consuming very quickly. They worked together, did shows together, and went through the good and bad times of the movie business together. Even though everything, they never got married. That wasn't a problem at first. They were two creative people who didn't want to follow the rules of society. As time went on, though, it became clear that they had different hopes and dreams for the future. Vanessa really wanted to have a family. They wanted to be together forever by having kids together. Dating was never something Dalton wanted, though. His thoughts were not on love lasting forever. It wasn't important to him to have a home of his own. He wanted love, but not to be tied down. In the end, that's what made them break up. For more than 10 years, they were still in love, but couldn't move on. Dalton was an independent person who decided how to live his life. No one could make him change, not even the woman he loved the most. On the other hand, Vanessa needed more security, which Dalton could never give her. They finally went their separate ways when they could no longer work out their differences. As with many Hollywood breakups, there were no fights, scandals, or messy lawsuits. There were just two people who could no longer go in the same direction. Vanessa kept working and made her own life. Dalton, on the other hand, went back to his own world. He was a man who never committed himself. Sadly, Dalton would then end up in another passionate relationship. Unfortunately, this time it wouldn't just end in breaking up, it would also involve betrayal. When Dalton was almost 50 years old, he met Oksana Grigorieva, a beautiful young Russian singer and pianist. Almost 20 years separated them, with a mysterious beauty of Eastern Europe and a charm that you can't resist. However, Oksana was not at all like Vanessa Redgrave. She wasn't a stage woman, and she wasn't a strong, independent actress who pushed him. She made him feel like the most important person in the room, like a strong man who could protect a weak woman. That was what made him want to know more. Their relationship grew quickly and passionately, a relationship that was very different from Dalton's last love. Oksana let him stay in charge, while Vanessa made him choose between his need for freedom and the expectations of a strong woman. He loved without worrying about being tied down. But Dalton wouldn't walk down the aisle, even when everything looked great. An individual who would not let anyone bind him. His opinion didn't change, even when Oksana got pregnant with their son. Alexander was their son. He was born in 1997. Even though he never married Oksana, Dalton was a great dad and did everything for his kid. Even though he always said Alexander was the best thing in his life, that didn't mean he would get married. Dalton thought the formula would work for a long time. Love with a lot of passion, no marriage or responsibilities, just wanted freedom. Sadly, he was wrong. Oksana wasn't Vanessa. There was no waiting, and she wasn't faithful. Things stopped working one day. It started to spread rumors. There were rumors going around in the media that Oksana was seeing someone else. Simply Peter Blomqvist. She wanted a safe, secure life and a marriage proposal from a Swedish millionaire, but Dalton would never give them those things. When the rumors turned out to be true, Dalton didn't say anything. He wasn't gave. The man got it. Long before it happened, he saw this coming. There is no way for a man who doesn't believe in commitment to be loyal. He ended the relationship in a quiet way, believing in his own worth while carrying a wound bigger than any part he had ever played. What made Dalton different, though, was that he never let his anger affect his son. A lot of men would have cut off all ties with a woman who cheated on them, but Dalton stayed a loving dad. He looked after Alexander and spent time with him. Even though his relationship with Oksana ended, he never turned his back on the woman who gave birth to his child. Although Oksana Grigorieva wasn't done yet, she was in a high-profile relationship with Mel Gibson, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood at the time, again a few years later. She broke up with Dalton in a quiet way, but this relationship turned into one of the biggest scandals in the entertainment business. Oksana accused Gibson of domestic abuse right away after giving birth to their daughter Lucia together in 2009, putting in for a restraining order and saying he had beaten her up. Things did not end there, though. People were shocked when audio recordings were leaked. Gibson was heard not only saying racist things, but also threatening to kill Oksana. Police were called, and Gibson was taken to court. He was finally given 3 years of probation, told to go to counseling, and told to do community service. Because of the scandal, he almost lost his job. Gibson used to be a big name in Hollywood, but he became an outcast and lost multi-million-dollar deals and was turned down by many of his peers in the business. No matter how crazy things were, one strange truth stayed the same. Tim Dalton was the only man who had ever loved Oksana and never said anything bad about her. He never spoke out against her in public, got into a court case, or went on TV to attack her like Mel Gibson did. He quietly left, but he kept his cool and did what he had to do as a father. When I think about the whole story, one question stays with me. Had Dalton really been betrayed, or had he put himself in a position where he would be left behind? A man who didn't believe in obligations, but expected people to be loyal. But there is one truth that can't be changed, no matter what the answer is. Tim Dalton is now alone after losing the two loves of his life. He may have always wanted that life. Tim Dalton is the perfect example of a classic Hollywood tragedy. He was a pioneer who was forgotten because he came too early. People didn't like him because he brought James Bond back to Ian Fleming's original idea. People thought it was a revolution when Daniel Craig came out as a Bond who was rougher, colder, and more like real life 20 years later. Actually, Dalton had already done it back in the 1980s. At the time, people just weren't ready for him. This isn't just something that Dalton's fans feel about. Even some of the smartest people in movie history have admitted it. Christopher Nolan, who is one of the most admired directors of our time, said that Dalton was the best connection to Fleming's books. In fact, Nolan said he wanted to direct a Bond movie in the style of Dalton's because he thought that was the most true to the character. Dalton's story is a tragedy of poor innovation judgment. License to Kill might have been a great movie if it came out in the early 2000s instead of 1989. But because it came out while people were still interested in Roger Moore's funny take on the role, Dalton was not given much attention. While Daniel Craig was doing well, people started to realize that Timothy Dalton wasn't failing. He was just ahead of his time. Dalton did more than just play Bond, though. He did not let Hollywood's neglect take over his life. Over the next few years, Dalton continued to show how versatile he was as an actor. He didn't want to be defined by Bond, which showed that he wasn't just an actor who had one famous role and then disappeared. He made a big impression on TV with Penny Dreadful, a gothic horror show in which he gave an amazingly deep and complex performance. The young Shakespearean actor and the cold, calculated 007 were no longer there. The actor was very experienced, bringing to the screen the depth and breadth of a long and interesting career. As the chief in Doom Patrol, Dalton once again showed that he could make even the strangest roles into iconic ones. In the DC universe, this person is mysterious and dangerous. He didn't need to be Bond. He didn't need to be a big star in Hollywood. Because of his talent, Dalton could rule the screen. But the thing that may have surprised him the most was that he contributed to an animated movie. It wasn't until after Toy Story 3's release that many people found out that Timothy Dalton was in the Oscar-nominated masterpiece. Even though it wasn't at all like the movies Dalton usually makes, he still managed to leave his mark on one of the best movies of the decade. Lastly, what is Timothy Dalton's real legacy? A Bond that got lost? An actor that Hollywood has given up on? Or an unknown hero whose worth is only now becoming fully understood? He might not have needed fame after all. He didn't try to be the star that Hollywood wanted on purpose. He only wanted to act and give his craft his all in his own unique way. And maybe someday Hollywood will look back and not remember Timothy Dalton as the Bond that was forgotten, but as the one who set the stage for everything else that came after. It was never a question of whether Dalton succeeded or failed. Will people ever see that he was successful a long time ago? That's the real question. Dalton is 79 years old, but he has never been married. Many of his peers have married and started families or enjoy the comforts of home life. He is the only James Bond who has never been married or tied down to anyone. It's almost like the character he played had written his own fate. Dalton is not, however, a man who is stuck alone because of tragedy. He has decided to live that way. No scandals, no social media, and no going to fancy events. Rather than the fancy parties in Hollywood, he enjoys simpler, more personal things like fishing in the Pacific, listening to jazz, and collecting rare antiques. He is a man who moves at his own pace in the middle of the chaos of the industry and always stays out of the spotlight. Even though Dalton has stayed away from the flashiness of Hollywood, he has a close relationship with his only son Alexander, whom he has with Oksana Grigorieva. Alexander is now an adult, living in the United States at the age of 28. He and his father do not live together, but they're still close and talk and meet up whenever they can. Alexander is the most important thing in Dalton's life, and even though he's not married, he's always been a good dad. Even more surprising is that Dalton and Oksana Grigorieva have stayed friendly, despite everything that happened between them in the past. There isn't any anger, resentment, or public fights like the ones between Oksana and Mel Gibson. Dalton publicly backed Oksana in her court case with Gibson, saying that they had put the past behind them and that the most important thing was their son's future. In a world where scandal and anger can break up relationships, Dalton stays calm and polite, which has always made him stand out from many of Hollywood's leading men. Even though Dalton doesn't go out in public very often, he can sometimes be seen cheering for his favorite football team at Manchester City Stadium. It's not like he plays James Bond anymore, but he still walks like a proper English gentleman and lives his life on his own terms, not looking for approval from other people. Maybe this is the best way to describe Timothy Dalton, a lone wolf who doesn't care about what other people think of him and isn't lonely at all. Even though Hollywood forgot about him, he never needed Hollywood to tell him how much he was worth. Timothy Dalton was the James Bond that people weren't ready for, but years later he would be praised and known for his work. It's possible that he wasn't the most popular James Bond, but there was no doubt that he was one of the most memorable. A pioneer who wasn't understood. A person who is firm in their beliefs. Rather than chasing fame or what other people want, he always chose his own path. He said no to marriage and Hollywood's glitz, but he never gave up being himself. Even though things were always changing around him, Dalton stayed the same. A cold and proper gentleman. A real wolf by himself. Maybe Timothy Dalton wouldn't have been just a forgotten legend, but the best James Bond of all time, if people back then had seen more. But Bond fans will always know that Dalton laid the groundwork for everything that came after, even if Hollywood moves on without him. Feelings about Timothy Dalton? Did he happen to be the wrong Bond at the wrong time? Tell us what you think in the comments. Please like and subscribe so that you don't miss any more interesting stories. You might realize that Timothy Dalton was never a forgotten James Bond after watching The Living Daylights and License to Kill Again. We were just slow to recognize how great he was.